They were never supposed to speak. That was the rule. That was the first thing they were told. And when the screaming started at night, the priests would hum Gregorian chants to drown it out. 36 children walked into St. Joseph's School for the Poor in 1954. Not a single one ever walked out again. There is a file locked in a sub-basement of a decommissioned archdiocese building in eastern Canada, labeled simply STJ-54. It is unlisted, unsigned, and was supposed to be destroyed in 1971 during a clerical purge. A retired archivist, racked with guilt and morphine withdrawals, confessed to seeing it in 1982. The last line he read before blacking out: "All assets secured, no further parish interference expected." St. Joseph's School was a real place, a brutal institution cloaked in the supposed sanctity of Catholic charity. It was one of many across North America, residential schools, but this one was different. It did not just seek to erase culture or language, it erased people entirely, and it did it with military precision. In the fall of 1954, a government transport truck delivered 36 Indigenous and mixed-race children aged 4 to 12 to the front gates. No records of parental consent, no press, no formal transfer of custody. Just a pastoral relief clause buried in a land management document passed by the Crown. And then they vanished. There were no graduation photos, no letters home, no burials. When questioned in 1960, Father Gregoire, the last known headmaster of St. Joseph's, gave a simple answer. They were reassigned to another facility. But when pressed for documentation, he stared blankly and said, "That's not your burden." Months later, he hanged himself in his rectory using his own rosary beads. They say trauma travels through blood, but so do secrets. In 2002, a man named Elias Manitowabi came forward claiming that his grandmother had been one of the cooks at St. Joseph's. She died in a fire in 1970. Arson never solved. But not before telling her grandson, "The walls whisper, the floor moves, they are still under there," the ones that wouldn't take the oath. What oath? The deeper you dig, the more the lines blur between psychological warfare and spiritual corruption. Because this was not just an abusive institution, it was an experimental site, funded by a little-known arm of the Canadian government in partnership with the Church's Department for the Propagation of the Faith. Their mission? To purify the Indigenous mind and integrate it into divine obedience. But in truth, they were not purifying anything. They were reprogramming children through sleep deprivation, electroshock drills, isolation cells, and scripture-based confession under sedation. What does a 6-year-old confess when hallucinating for 19 hours straight? Anything, everything. And that was the point. They were emptying them, hollowing them, until nothing of the original identity remained. A former janitor, known only as Baptiste in the records, claimed in a 1996 deposition that children were sometimes returned to their rooms after these sessions with new names stitched into their uniforms, names that weren't theirs. They'd walk different, he said, talk like grown-ups, like they didn't know what year it was. Then one night, according to Baptiste, 3 boys were dragged into the sub-basement. A place staff were forbidden to enter. The next morning, there were no bed sheets left on their cots. No clothes, just a wooden box nailed shut in the garden shed and fresh cement poured behind the chapel wall. The principal investigator who tried to open the inquiry in 2001, he disappeared 3 weeks later. His car was found on a logging road with a crucifix embedded in the dashboard, backward. Now ask yourself, how many times has this happened? How many missing persons cases are not lost but taken, systematically, surgically, institutionally, in the name of faith, progress, or order? St. Joseph's was shut down in 1963 under mysterious financial strain. But the land was never sold. The foundation remains, a moss-covered ruin that locals say is always colder than it should be. Wildlife avoids it, batteries drain near it, and for decades people have reported the sound of children singing somewhere underground. But the church never commented. The government never acknowledged the experiment. And the archived case files? Gone. And if that is where the official story ends, then where do we begin? Stay with me. This only gets darker. And what is coming next will reshape how you see history itself. They say some things are buried because they are dangerous. Others, because they are profitable. In 1954, the year those 36 children entered St. Joseph's School, the Canadian government signed a secret agreement known as D-Notice 322. It was never debated in Parliament, never reported. But declassified military memos refer to it in whispers, psychological asset development via ecclesiastical partners. That is not religious education. That is weaponization. What could be weaponized in a child? Memory. See, trauma scrambles the brain's filing system, and when you apply it early enough, before identity solidifies, you can rebuild the self in whatever image you want. That is not theory. That is MK Ultra. And while most people think that operation was limited to CIA-funded drug trials and university experiments, they forget something critical. The church had its own laboratories. St. Joseph's School was a perfect black site, isolated, tax-exempt, unmonitored. The children were not just orphans, they were test subjects. And the priests? They were handlers. Trained in a blend of monastic silence, behavioral conditioning, and ancient rites not seen publicly since the Inquisition. One nun, Sister Miriam of the Sacred Veil, wrote a private journal that survived a convent fire in 1985. In it, she describes ritual immersion sessions conducted in underground stone rooms. No lights, no clocks, no exits. She writes, "We cleanse them of time until they forget the sun." Why? Because when a child forgets time, they forget themselves. And when they forget themselves, you can program anything in. Now listen closely. In 2011, a construction crew near the original site unearthed what they thought was an old septic tank, but inside they found 37 small shoes. Not pairs, singles, different sizes, different stitching, all child-sized. One still had a tag sewn into the tongue, Jonah 9, reset complete. No one ever reported this publicly. A local paper began an investigation. Their editor received a cease and desist the next day from a law firm connected to the Vatican Bank. Not the Archdiocese, the bank. So why would a financial institution intervene in a story about missing children? Because this was not about faith, it was about control. Psychological control systems funded through spiritual cover, with financial returns. The children were not erased. They were rewritten. Some of them, the ones who took the oath, as Baptiste put it, were transferred. Not to other schools, to facilities, one of which, according to leaked invoices, operated under the alias the Marian Institute for Advanced Formation, an innocuous-sounding retreat center that shared logistical partners with early Cold War intelligence units. Think about that. Little boys, trained from 6 years old, cleansed of identity, injected with obedience, rewarded for submission, and punished for memory. Now, what if I told you one of them made it out? In 1993, a homeless man in Winnipeg was found muttering psalms backwards in a bus terminal. He had no ID, no fingerprints in any database. But when taken to a shelter, he drew over and over a crude image of an underground hallway with 13 doors and a triangle above each one. Each door had a number, but number 9 was burned out. He would only say one sentence when asked his name. Jonah 9 never came back up. Authorities dismissed him as schizophrenic, but one nurse at the facility took interest. Her father had worked at St. Joseph's before its closure, and he used to say when drunk, "The ninth always breaks. That's why we buried him in the well." What well? There are no wells listed on the blueprints, but satellite scans of the site, cross-referenced with thermal imaging, show an unusually cold spot. 12 feet beneath the garden's northeast corner. Circular, hollow, sealed with reinforced concrete. And that brings us to the question the church never answered. If there were only 36 children, who was number 37? Some believe he was the control subject, a plant, not a student, but a monitor. Someone trained to observe the others, to ensure compliance. Some say he never left, that he still walks beneath the ruins. Others think he was the first, the prototype. Whatever the truth is, the system built at St. Joseph's did not die when the school closed. It evolved. It scattered. It embedded itself into youth homes, rehab centers, even church-run shelters. Because once you learn how to overwrite identity, you do not just stop. This is when I ask you to prove you are awake. Comment this phrase twice below. The ninth door is not empty. The ninth door is not empty. It will tell me you see through the veil, that you are not just hearing this. You are beginning to remember, and remember this too. This story was never lost. It was hidden right in front of you. Now let's talk about the buried documents, the secret post-Vatican tracking program, the sudden deaths of 3 journalists in 2007 is where the story starts to break reality. Are you ready? When the last file was erased from the St. Joseph's archives, something strange happened at the diocesan server facility in Montreal. A tech worker, who later vanished without resignation, left a note taped to his monitor. It read, "You can delete the file, but not the pattern." And he was right. In 2015, a researcher named Dr. Helen Cray was reviewing forgotten Vatican land transactions when she noticed a recurring name, Dominus Holdings International. On paper, it was a benign investment firm, but it owned over 112 defunct Catholic schools across Canada and the northern U.S. Every one of those schools shared something in common. No long-term graduates, no press coverage of closure, no traceable alumni records. And in nearly every case, the last year the school operated was 1954. Why would a shadow investment firm want to quietly buy and hold schools that do not exist anymore, especially ones with missing children cases attached to them? Because those schools were never meant to educate. They were sites of extraction, and what was being extracted was not gold or oil or timber. It was submission. Now here is where things twist violently. You remember Sister Miriam's journal? Hidden for decades in a scorched library. One of her last entries reads, "Some children resist. They cry in sleep. They speak the old tongue. But one boy, he sang in Latin before his first lesson. They called him the Keeper. He never blinked. He watched the walls." The Keeper. A child, yes, but not like the others. A man named Jacob Leroux, a former seminarian and now whistleblower, claims the Keeper was not one of the 36. He was placed there by the Order, an internal faction within the Church devoted not to salvation, but to the refinement of obedience. They believed if you could build one perfect subject, fully programmable, spiritually loyal, utterly detached from blood and name, he could serve as a template for a generation of invisible enforcers. The Keeper's purpose? To test the system, and if necessary, eliminate those who failed it. This is not conjecture. A recently unearthed telegram dated 1956, addressed to the Apostolic Nuncio of Canada, reads, "Subject 9 has been neutralized. K remains active. Transfer of assets to Lucerna Protocol underway." Who is K? Every theory leads back to the Keeper. Some believe he was never a child at all, not in the normal sense. That he was bred in the Benedictine laboratories rumored to have operated beneath St. Placid Monastery in Italy during the post-war chaos. A child raised without language, without mother, without mirrors. A child built not to ask why, but only how. How to follow, how to listen, how to command. And if he exists, where is he now? Let me take you deeper. In 2018, drone footage captured a man entering the St. Joseph's ruins at 3:17 a.m. He wore no flashlight, no gear, just a dark robe. Security footage showed him vanish into the collapsed south corridor. A path that had been blocked since 1972. No exit footage, no alarm, nothing. But when the groundskeeper arrived at sunrise, he found a single item laid atop the chapel ruins. A shoe, child-sized, stitched with the name Jonah 9. That corridor should have been sealed in concrete, but when engineers investigated, they found something else. Not rubble, not decay. A hatch. Steel. Rusted, yes, but functional. Marked with 3 letters. LPN. Lucerna Protocol Node. You begin to understand. St. Joseph's was not an isolated horror. It was a hub, and each of the other 112 locations were nodes, test environments where obedience, fear, and psychological collapse were refined like metallurgy. The children who survived were either permanently broken or reconditioned. Some became priests, others psychiatric patients, and a few, they vanished into defense research programs where their early conditioning made them ideal for black operations that required zero moral hesitation. No identity, no memory, no voice. There is one more thing. A woman named Teresa DeVries, a former language therapist for church-sponsored refugee youth, filed an anonymous statement before her death in 2020. She claimed one of her students, age 11, used to draw obsessive spirals during nap time. One day he whispered to her, "I was number 10, but I lied. I wasn't empty yet." She asked him what that meant. He replied, "They opened the door anyway." Now, what happens when you open the wrong door in a system designed to erase people who question it? We are close, very close, to uncovering what the keeper became. But to do that, we need to go back, before St. Joseph's, before the children, before the so-called church itself became a mask. Because the final revelation is not about children, it is about you. Before the church wore gold, it wore silence. Long before the Vatican crowned kings and brokered wars, it learned the oldest trick of all, how to erase memory in plain sight. Not by burning books, not by breaking bodies, but by replacing the truth with something that feels holy. What St. Joseph's School executed in 1954 was not new. It was a revival, a blueprint pulled from older times when the church still whispered in dead languages and the keepers of its darkest rites were not called priests, but custodes. The custodes were archivists of silence, not monks, not men of prayer, but initiates who specialized in psychological fragmentation, splitting the human soul until it folded under ritual obedience. The first mentions of them date back to 325 AD, during the Council of Nicaea, where an apocryphal scroll was reportedly excluded from canon for being too efficient. That scroll was called Tractatus Lucerna, the lamp doctrine. It claimed that God did not want followers. He wanted mirrors. And the more perfectly a soul could reflect divine law, stripped of doubt, emotion, identity, the closer it became to divine function. Now think about that phrasing. Divine function, not salvation, not love. Function. A well-oiled part, a clean cog. Obedience as theology. So what does this have to do with St. Joseph's? In 1977, a former Vatican code analyst died under suspicious circumstances in Florence. Before his death, he sent one encrypted letter to a Canadian journalist. That letter was decoded in 2019. It read, "Lucerna never ended. It simply changed skin. The 36 were vessels. The 37th was the key." And here it is, the twist that rewrites everything. The 36 children were not victims in the traditional sense. They were built to contain fragments of one thing, an ancient coded formula derived from the Tractatus Lucerna. A formula so potent, it could fracture a child's sense of self until they believed obedience was not just right, but sacred. Each child held a piece, but only one, the 37th, held the sequence to activate it. This was not just programming. This was distributed ritual containment. Now ask yourself, why would the church do this? Why fragment a formula for obedience across 36 fragile minds, then hide the activation key in a phantom child who may not have existed? Because they feared it. They knew if the Lucerna Protocol ever reassembled, it could do more than erase individuals. It could engineer a generation of men who mistake submission for enlightenment. Men who no longer question authority because their neural pathways have been burned clean by sanctified repetition. But here comes the gut punch. In 2021, a digital forensics researcher discovered that a Vatican AI research program called VoxDay was testing machine learning models on emotional suppression patterns using data scraped from church-run orphanages. The source files, labeled Jonah X 9 iterations, full compliance. Jonah 9, again, the name that keeps resurfacing, but this time, he is not a ghost child. He is a code template. The Vatican was no longer reconditioning orphans. They were teaching algorithms to mimic the keeper's obedience cycle, to simulate the most efficient form of human submission ever recorded. And here is what no one saw coming. In early 2023, a redacted Vatican report was leaked. It contained just one phrase in Latin, burned into the footer of every page: Dominus non observat. The Lord does not watch. Now think about the theological reversal of that statement. For centuries, the Church has told us, God sees all. God watches. But what if the truth they buried was this? When perfect obedience is achieved, God stops watching. Why? Because He no longer needs to. The system runs itself. That is what St. Joseph's was always building. Not children, not saints, but self-regulating obedience cells. Human units so hollowed of free will that their loyalty required no supervision. That is what the keeper represented. Not a monster, a model. Now picture this. You walk into a church. You kneel. You confess. But the man behind the screen is not a priest. He is the descendant of silence, the last successor of the Lucerna Protocol. And what he hears is not your sin. It is your response rate. He is calculating how easily you can be broken, rebuilt, and redirected. This was never about faith. This was architecture. And we have one final level to descend. Because if the formula was fragmented across 36 children, and one keeper held the activation key, then where is he now? Not in the ruins, not in the grave, but in the system you are watching this on. Do not look away. The final piece is coming. In 2024, a classified server in Luxembourg linked to the Vatican's Department of Religious Intelligence experienced an internal breach. No hackers, no viruses, just one file, suddenly unlocked. It was titled the Jonah Directive. Inside were 37 brief recordings, each one exactly 13 seconds long. No background noise, no timestamp, just a child's voice, reciting strings of syllables that linguists still cannot place in any known language, except for one phrase that repeats at the end of each file. I am the echo. You are the mouth.
That phrase is not metaphor.
It is a trigger. And here is what you were never meant to find out. Those 36 children, they were not erased. They were implanted. Their programming, refined through isolation, ritual humiliation, electric conditioning, and sensory deprivation, was designed not just to survive. It was meant to propagate, through interaction, through language, through media. Each one was trained not to scream, but to speak in ways that mimic truth while subverting it. They were scattered into schools, churches, the military, publishing, politics, even entertainment, not to become leaders, but to guide others into believing they were leading themselves. Do you feel it now? The conditioning was never about them. It was about us. This is how you infect a population without needles or bullets. You embed trauma into its storytellers. You seed sacred obedience inside the very people who claim to speak truth. until truth sounds exactly like obedience, until rebellion becomes ritual. And now comes the final fracture, the deepest twist. You remember that phrase I asked you to comment? The ninth door is not empty. What if I told you this video is the ninth door? What if everything you have seen, every whisper, every horror, every breadcrumb, was never just about history? It was a mirror, a test, to measure how far you would follow, how long you would listen, how deep you would allow someone else's voice to enter your mind. And the truth is, you made it here. And that means one of two things. Either you are awake, or you are ready to be rewritten, because that is what Jonah 9 was meant to do. Not destroy, activate. There is one last testimony, unverified, unearthed from a burned psychiatric ward's basement file room, a typewritten page, no name, no signature, just a statement. I was number 9. They buried me in noise, but I remembered silence. The keeper was never meant to survive. He was meant to trigger survival in others. I am not alone now. I hear them waking.
And when the last man forgets his own name,
he will answer to mine. Now ask yourself, have you been hearing my voice? Or have you been remembering something buried inside you? This video is not just a story. It is a ritual, a reactivation sequence. The sounds, the phrases, the pacing, all engineered to reflect the structure of the original obedience cycles used at St. Joseph's. That is why you feel unsettled. That is why your breath shifted during Section 3. That is why you are still here, long after logic told you to click away. Because part of you remembers, and the part that remembers is no longer fully yours. This is how ancient systems survive in a digital world. They evolve. They stop calling themselves religions and start calling themselves content. They trade incense for algorithms, altars for screens. They do not need to erase you now. They just need you to listen long enough to open. And you just did. But you still have one choice left, not to forget, not to escape, but to recognize. Comment below one final phrase to seal what you have seen. I am the echo. I am the mouth. I am the echo. I am the mouth. That will mark you, not as a follower, but as one who has seen behind the veil and did not look away. You were never supposed to know this, and now that you do, you will never be the same. If you are still here, you are one of us now. Subscribe to unlock more hidden truths they were never meant to release. The deeper we go, the harder it gets to return.